Hi, Jose. Thank you for taking the time to come chat with me and provide this content to your followers.
No, thanks for having me, Jessica.
So, I'm sure a lot of your followers are clients, but some may not be. You're an immigration attorney, you're very experienced. Tell us a little bit about you, about Jose.
So I am a business immigration attorney, but first I am born and raised Guatemalan. I came to the U.S. 20 odd years ago for college, and I stuck around.
Good.
Um, I live here in Miami with my wife and my kiddo,
Oh.
and our dog Priscilla. And I'm a business immigration attorney, so that means we help people primarily in two buckets. One bucket is U.S. employers, and that can be an employer who's trying to hire a specific person, a superstar who happens to be foreign, or they're just looking to hire abroad because they can't find enough qualified candidates here in the US. And the other bucket is foreign nationals, and it's foreign nationals who want to come to the US for any purpose, personal or professional, on the basis of their resume, their education, their money, or their business interests.
Right. That's awesome. So before we got on camera, we were talking a little bit about the different ways that these foreign nationals can come to the US because
Right.
we have that in common. We both work with foreign nationals in different areas. You help them with immigration, I help them with, corporations and building their businesses here. But there's a little bit of overlap, which is what we have synergy in. So tell me a little bit about these foreign nationals and like how do you help them? What are the different options that you offer them or talk to them about?
Sure. So there's a few things to keep in mind. Most types of employment-based visas require the sponsorship of a U.S. employer,
Hmm.
but there's a few that don't. And one of them is the E2 visa. It's an investment-based visa, and so those are available to nationals of certain countries that have a bilateral treaty with the U.S. That make a substantial investment into starting up or purchasing a company in the U.S. that they plan to then control or manage in some way. Uh,
Okay. You mentioned substantial investment.
right.
So, can you expand on that a little bit? I know people always want to hear a specific number, but
And yeah, I mean, substantial. It's contextual,
right.
and I think that's one big misconception about E2s. That's probably one of the biggest misconceptions is people have this $100,000 number in their head, and I've seen this in attorneys, I've seen this in applicants, I've seen this all over the place, and I'm not 100% sure where that comes from. Um, but it's not true. Substantial, there's different tests for that. Substantial can mean um, enough money to successfully launch and operate the startup that you're founding. It can mean enough to purchase the business that you're buying. So substantial enough to um, own or start up a successful business here in the US. Substantial also means enough money for immigration to consider that you're committed to your project here, that you're not
Mm.
going to. When I started my law firm, it was me, a laptop, and a few
Right.
software licenses and an internet connection. And so if it had failed, I didn't really have a lot to lose. I could have just, abandoned that and tried something else or gotten a job. So it has to be enough for the immigration official who's considering your case to consider that you're in it, that you have skin in the game,
Skin in the game,
right?
right?
And it can also mean in what percentage of the business you are purchasing or you will own in the startup. So, and this might be where the $100,000 figure comes from, because there's some language in the regulations that says in a smaller company, and they use the example, a company that's worth $100,000, they would
Hmm.
expect you to own 100% of that company for your investment to be substantial.
Mm.
Whereas if you're investing into a company that's worth $100 million, then a $10 million investment, even though it's only 10% of the company, is going to be substantial, because $10 million is a lot for anybody, right?
Right,
And
right.
so maybe that's where the $100,000 figure comes from, but it's not accurate. And I think people might get scared away by that, or just limit their thinking about what kind of business opportunities might be beneficial to them. So I'm working with one investor right now, and he's starting a landscaping company, and
Mm,
he's contributing a truck that he already owns, and so that's going to be an in-kind contribution. And then he's purchasing, of course, landscaping equipment, and he's going to invest some money into putting the company's logo onto
right.
the truck, etc. But his cash investment is not going to be huge. I think all in, including the in-kind value of the truck, he's going to invest maybe $60,000, and I'm pretty sure it'll be a successful E2.
Right. And you mentioned cash, you mentioned property that's going to be used for the business.
Right.
What other kinds of things can be included and taken into account for USCIS purposes in these expenses or these costs that you're or contributions you're doing to your business?
Anything in value that's a start, if we're talking about a new company that you're starting up, anything that is considered a startup cost, it can mean intellectual property. For example, if you own a patent that will be
Oh,
used
that's
to
interesting.
sell a product, if you own copyrights, trademarks, etc., that's something of value that is a startup cost of the company.
Right.
You would have to acquire that patent if otherwise, right?
And they're pricey.
And they're not cheap, right? Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So or money used to purchase, and that's another thing to keep in mind, that it has to be a startup cost, not a recurring cost of the company, um, because immigration considers that should be paid for out of the earnings of the company.
Right.
There's a few exceptions. You can prepay up to a year of rent, for example, as a startup cost.
Okay.
But it comes up where somebody says, well, I invested so much money into starting up this business. I paid all my employees' salaries out of my pocket during the whole first year, but that's a recurring expense that
Right.
immigration really expects that
To be a cost of the company, not
to come
a
from the
startup.
company's revenue, and not your personal investment, even if it really
Wow.
came from your own personal funds.
Right. How about paying you, for example? Is that or their accountant that is starting the company or are any of those expenses taken into account for their visa?
They can be justified as a startup expense usually. So
Hmm.
because if if the company would not exist but for the investor, then and the investor has to be here to direct the company, then it's legitimately considered a startup expense. And the same goes for the corporate attorney who helped set up the company, or the
Right.
accountants who set up the books, etc.
Right. And so you mentioned these investors and these business owners. Do they all have to have a certain amount of business experience or experience running a business in their own country? What is the qualification for that? Or can they be, someone that just wants to start a business now in the United States and doesn't really have a lot of experience?
Well, at the consulate, the officer will, one thing they want to know is this business going, I'm going to give you a visa usually for 5 years. Is this business going to succeed or not? And so they can take into account the investor's trajectory. Does he or she have experience in
Right.
starting up a business, running a business, or if it's a business that's very trade specific, do they have experience in this occupation? Because if they don't, then
Right.
they'll give you a visa and you come over, it fails in 6 months, and then there's a problem.
Right. And so how about if they want to come in a trade that they don't have experience in? So is that possible, right?
Sure, it is, and we ran into that in a case recently where um, somebody had already filed their own
Mhm.
which I don't usually recommend,
Right.
because it on its face the requirements are pretty simple, right?
Mhm.
On its face, the visa has pretty simple requirements that are you an individual who invested a substantial amount of money into um, a business that has your nationality, meaning that 50% of the business has is owned by people from the country that
That's
has the
soliciting
treaty.
the E2. Uh-huh.
And so that's easy to understand. It's hard, but there are so many other kind of underlying rules and pitfalls to avoid, and you don't know what you don't know, right?
Right.
And so in this case, um, it was somebody who was in the financial services field, and you need a license for what he does here in the U.S. And so he planned to open a consultancy offering those types of services here, and they gave him problems at the consulate. They denied his visa because he didn't have a license. So,
Right.
and he was, according to the business plan, the only employee,
Right.
at least at first, right? He had plans to hire, etc. But and so how we got around that is we refiled, but he found some contract employees here in the U.S. who would actually offer those services on his behalf while he was able to get his visa. Because on top of that, for that particular license, you need a social security number to apply for the license, and so he was in a catch-22 where he
Right.
couldn't get a social security number until he had the visa, but he couldn't get
Because-
the visa without the social. So
Yeah.
he hired a few part-time professionals who could at least offer some services and get the business off the ground while he applied for the visa and got it, and then we were able to apply.
Do you usually see in, with your clients, do you, because they have various options in opening businesses. So when I help, immigration attorneys like yourself on the business side, right, to help their clients either build their business or buy a business, they have several options of starting from scratch, right?
Hmm.
They're starting here, like you're the client you just mentioned, he's building it up from zero, or they can buy a running business, right? So there's a restaurant, it's running, they're buying it and stepping in, or they could do franchising, right? That's
Right.
another option for clients that maybe don't have a lot of experience in one industry and it's turnkey. So, do you see that one option is more popular with the clients that you work with?
I think I see that more clients who come into it with the idea of I want to start this business,
Okay.
and um, I I kind of think that some part of it's kind of romantic. It's just, I have some money to spend and I want to
Yeah.
come to, and I've always dreamed of, opening a cupcake company, even though like I've worked in the banking sector my whole life, but I've always wanted, what if I had a cupcake company? So I'll start it. And
Yes.
it's okay, great. But, you're relocating yourself and your family and hinging all this on this cupcake company where you don't have any experience, and maybe you would be better served purchasing a franchise
Hmm.
that where you'll have an instruction manual on how to, and resources and etc. on how to
Right.
successfully open your baking company, even though you're not a baker. Um, and eh, Purchasing an existing solvent business might be, I think also a lot of E2 clients, they don't want to really roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty and be involved in the excruciating day to day of a new business. And
Right.
sometimes they haven't considered that it might be a better option to just purchase something that's up and running, has a customer base, has trained employees, has management in
Right.
place, and where they can be involved in a business in a strategic, kind of more hands off sort of way.
Yeah.
That'll be a lot less stressful and a lot less risky.
Yes.
A lot less risky.
I agree.
Um, so I think more people come into it with a startup mentality, but I often suggest that they at least consider the other alternatives because they might be a better fit for
Yeah.
where they are in life or what they want out of their experience when they're here in the US.
Right. And you were mentioning also that a lot of the thing that the government looks at is, okay, the success rate, what's the possibility of success and the projections, right? We help them with their business plans. So we have to look at those numbers when you have a franchise. And this is not to say anything against the other types of options because I help them with those too. But you would say that with franchising, there's a little bit more history and financial information that you can work with, right?
And even the franchisors usually have an analysis of their own to say, okay,
Right.
well, you should put the franchise here and not here because, based on our numbers, you're more likely to succeed here.
Yeah.
And things that you might not have access to that kind of market information as an individual.
Right.
Um, and just statistically, startups are more likely to fail. And again, going back to the whole romantic aspect of it, there seems to be a disproportionate amount of E2 investors that want to get into food service,
Oh my goodness.
and I can relate to that. Like I can think of instances where I've been somewhere like in a cute, quaint town with my wife, and we're eating a croissant and having coffee. Say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we just kind of opened up a shop right here and served our own croissants with our own coffee? And it sounds nice, but food service businesses fail more rapidly than almost any other kind of business, and have cutthroat margins, and it's a tough business to be in, as
Yeah.
romantic as it is. So
When you mentioned that people have these dreams of opening certain types of business, that's what came to mind because I can't tell you how many people want to open a restaurant and have no idea of what it takes to open a restaurant and make it successful. I have family in the business and a lot of my clients are restaurateurs on the trademark end. And yeah, it's a hard industry.
It is. My dad, he's in hospitality, and so
Yeah.
they have a restaurant on site, and I know how that works. And look, don't get me wrong, food service can be the fit for some investors. I'm
Right, right,
working with
right.
one person. I mean, he just retired as he was the finance manager for a Latin American fast food chain that he's been working in the fast food industry
Right.
his whole adult life and has substantial experience in that. And so it's a perfect fit for him to come and open
Right.
a food chain, right?
Right.
And even he's going the franchise route, by the way. Even though he knows the ins and outs of the business, and he just decided that it make more financial and business sense
Mhm.
to buy a franchise than to start his own.
Yeah, and sometimes the numbers don't lie, right? So sometimes it's time and comfort, and again, everyone has different circumstances, different experience, and so that's why there's so many options, and it's good that they evaluate those, and with real numbers and with their real
And
circumstances.
frankly, like I can make suggestions about those things based on what I've seen with my own clients, but I'm not necessarily the best qualified person
Mhm.
to advise them on what type of business they should acquire, or whether they should go with a franchise or an existing business or open their own, or which franchise they should go
Right.
with, or which business they should buy. I can Same thing with the structure of their company. Like I can tell them at a very, very, very high level um, whether it makes more sense for them to have a corporation or an LLC or to do this or that. But I can't. I don't, just because it's not my bread and butter.
Yeah.
And I know what I do well and what I don't, and I'd rather give them no advice than
Right.
half the advice. And so usually when it comes to areas that I'm not qualified in, I will just straight out refer them to the appropriate professional, whether that's a corporate attorney or a business broker or a
Right.
franchise consultant who can um, give them all the expertise instead of just some half-baked, high-level suggestion.
Yeah, but it's interesting because you, as the immigration attorney, sometimes you're their first contact here in the US, right? And so you kind of become their quarterback.
Yep.
And you are the one that links them to, let's say, if they need a business broker or a corporate attorney, etc. And so it's so important that they pick someone that's qualified, especially because there's so many, unfortunately, in the immigration world, there's so many scammers, right?
Yep.
And so it's important that they do their due diligence and do their research to make sure that they're dealing with a professional like you.
And it goes both ways also, because immigration is incredibly complex. On its face, it looks like a very simple thing to do because it's forms and you fill them out and you
Mm-hmm.
attach a few things and it looks easy. And as an attorney, it's easy to do it's easy to do poorly but look like you're doing your job.
Right.
And it's easy also for other attorneys that are not immigration attorneys to dabble and say, well, this looks easy enough. It looks like a form. And that's where I see often the most mistakes, is where you have an attorney who's a very good tax attorney, a very good corporate attorney, very good any other kind of attorney, and they decide that they can pull this one off.
Yeah.
And usually the applicant might have either been better off on their own, because at least the consular officer would have had sympathy for them,
Right. It's like, yeah,
versus this was prepared by a professional and is just doesn't qualify.
that's
Um,
awful.
yeah.
It's funny that you said that immigration is easy to dabble in. I completely disagree. I mean,
It,
I'm not a dabbler. Since I graduated, what I do is business law. That's all I do. And but I did do immigration during law school. I was a part of the clinic, and I thought it was crazy difficult because the laws constantly change. So you have to be on top of it all the time to make sure that your information is up to date, because there's so much information on, especially on immigration, on social media, on TikTok, right? There's everyone talking
and misinformation, right?
misinformation.
Misinformation. Plus, ours is a field that changes with the political times, and so every
Yes.
4 years is a completely new set of rules.
Mm-hmm.
So
I agree.
it's
But
yeah.
that's exactly why I was like, oh, I don't have the bandwidth to do this, because you guys have to be up to date all the time. I remember I was in law school, and from the time I started my semester to ended, the laws had changed and I was working on a case. I'm like, what do I do now? Right. But that's like your everyday in a way. You have to stay on top of it. And um there's so many attorneys that dabble that they can't do it all,
Mhm.
right? So it's important that they make sure that they work with someone that focuses on business immigration visas when they work with you.
And even that business immigration, because
Yeah.
um, at different points in my career, I've also handled other types of immigration, and at one eventually I made a conscious decision to focus only on business immigration because the regulations that cover asylum versus family law versus business immigration are different, and it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to keep up and stay competent in all of them. And so I'd rather just be very good at what I do versus pretty good at many other things.
I agree. I have the same
Yeah.
philosophy. I tell people that every day, every year, I weed out more things of from our practice because even though we only do business law, there's so many things that fall under it, right? And we want to make sure that we serve our clients, full fledged. We know exactly what we're talking about, and there's just so much information out there. So it's important that they don't walk into what we call door law, right? A door law
Yeah.
firm,
Yeah.
everything that walks
Yeah.
through the door, they take because they could be underserved. And well, you would know this in many Latin American countries, attorneys are generalists, right? It's
Hmm.
not as much as here that we all kind of have a niche. So they may be used to that, right? Do you see that often?
As you were saying that, I just remember that
Mhm.
I need to get back to somebody who just asked me if I could write an LLC operating agreement for them, and it's I don't do that. I,
Right. Well, you can send
yeah.
them right over.
Yep. Yep.
You also mentioned a little while ago, and I chuckled a little bit that you had a client that did it on his own, and you were just like, it kind of caused a delay and a problem in his process. So I'm sure you have many more of these stories. What kind of tell us a story of a client that maybe decided he wanted to do this on his own, both the business side and the immigration side, and how did that affect the timelines and the process for you once you actually took it on?
I can't point to a specific case right now, but the delays can be substantial, especially because um, most types of business visas, you start by filing a petition here in the US with USCIS, the US Immigration Agency. And once that's approved, you get an interview in your country, which you can usually get very quickly
Hmm.
to get your actual visa and your passport. E2s are one of the few types of visas where that doesn't happen, where you go straight to the consulate, apply there, and the waiting times in many consulates are awful. They're
Wow.
months, sometimes years long, and so waiting a year and a half, 2 years for an interview, showing up and getting denied. I mean that's a huge setback, and
Yeah.
you need to have your business up and running or very close to it by the time you apply. And so a setback of 2 years can mean life or death for a company that, especially if it's a startup and it requires its owner here to run the to run the business.
I would argue a few months could mean life or death for a business if we're not having the owner around.
And even more so, one strategy that's popular because of those long consular times is to come in as a tourist or some other kind of non-immigrant visa and then change status to investor. And that it can be helpful because it can let you come to the US, start the business and operate it while you get an appointment at the consulate. But you're stuck in the US in the meantime. That change of status is valid only while you're here during that particular stay in the US. Once you leave, you don't get a visa document in your passport that allows you to come back as an investor until you go to an interview. So
Wow.
2 years is a long time to be stuck in the US while you wait for an interview. Um, More so because most people who are applying for an E2 visa um, tend to be people who have the means to invest and are used to being able to come and go as they please
Right.
and not being stuck somewhere without traveling internationally.
Right.
So, or and they might have interests in their home country that they need to attend to, etc. And so, um, even waiting for your interview can be excruciating when you're stuck here, and even more so. And then if the business has been running for a year or two, and
Right.
then you travel for the interview and it's denied, and you can't come back, then you have a business that's up and running and stuck here without you to run it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
So
that could be
so
very
it's
stressful.
because you don't know the outcome until you're at the consulate. It's crucial that you get it right.
Right. And not and you're talking about the delays once you submit your application. That's not even including the delays of, how long did it take you to find a business, right? Because you don't know the area and you didn't hire a broker that was experienced, for
Even if you
example.
hire one, I think it people complain a lot about the waiting times at the consulates, and when we have a consult with a client, and they find out how long the
Yeah.
estimated wait times are at their home country's consulate, um, but then they pull a trigger, and what ends up happening is that the time they take to actually get the business up and running, or to purchase or to close the transaction or what have you, ends up being a lot longer
Yeah.
than what the consulate took to adjudicate it. And it's it's easy for investors to be overly optimistic about how long it'll how quickly they can really get the business in a condition where it's ready for filing.
Yeah. I think it's also important that, they're in such a rush. They have a lot of urgency to close on a business so that they can get their visa, that sometimes, they want to cut corners because they think everything is ready to go. I had a client recently. We were purchasing a business for his E2. And he came, everything was negotiated. We just had to, you know, do the documents so that we can hand it over to his immigration attorney. But no one had reviewed the lease of the location, and what no one had seen was that the lease was about to expire in 3 months. So when he would receive the lease, they can technically kick him out of the business in 3 months. So when we tried to negotiate with the landlord, he wasn't planning on giving him more of a lease, didn't want to. And so he would have lost that if we wouldn't have taken that time to just slow down and look at the lease. No one was looking at something like that. So, it's having the right team members, like you said, you're the quarterback, finding the right team for your client so that they know that they're going through this process that's already stressful, that they could have a little bit more peace of mind.
And
Yeah.
that's one of my favorite parts of the job, is being that point person when
Mm-hmm.
being the applicant's first entry point into the
Yeah.
US, and directing them to all sorts of people who can help. And sometimes that's even like doctors for their kids, or
Right.
helping them decide where to move because there's better schools. And so
Yeah.
it's fun, and I'm kind of like a tour guide sometimes, or
Yeah.
I enjoy it.
I think it's beautiful. I tell my clients, I have people call me even when they're like, "Do you know a good plumber?"
Yep.
And I'm just like, "I do," but I do usually don't get these calls. But it's beautiful because it shows that your clients trust you, right? And that they look at you as a resource, which is a beautiful thing. Especially when they're coming from another country, and really need to have someone that has, a good moral compass and not taking advantage of them.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful. So one of the things that we talked about and we're starting to talk about before we got on camera was you had mentioned the L1s, and that's a different type of visa.
Hmm.
And we were talking the pros and cons of each and why what one would be better than the other in some circumstances. Let's get back into that conversation. Can you
Sure.
explain a little bit? So we talked about the E2s. Explain a little bit about the L1s and then the different situations where one might be better than the other.
Sure. So an L1 visa is used to transfer employees between different international affiliates of a multinational. So the basic requirements are the basic requirement is that there exists at least one affiliate of the business abroad
Mm-hmm.
and one in the US, and that they have some corporate relationship, that they're either parent subsidiary or have some common shareholders. Um, and that the employee they're seeking to transfer is either an executive of the company, a manager, or a specialized knowledge worker, who is somebody who has deep knowledge about the business and its processes, and that would be hard to replace here in the US.
Right.
Um, and it, many people who qualify for one might qualify for the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, for example, you might have a situation where an investor is opening an e-company here, a startup,
Mm-hmm.
that happens to, but also still owns their own business in their
Mm-hmm.
home country, and they are the 100% shareholder of both of them. So they're affiliates, they're corporate
Right.
affiliates, right? And so you have the option of filing as an L1 or as an E2, and there's advantages and disadvantages to each one. Um, the L is available in a lot of instances where the E isn't, because the E is only available to nationals of certain countries that have a treaty with the US.
Mm-hmm.
The L does not. And so if you or maybe your spouse are not a national of a country on the E list, then you're out
Mm.
of luck unless there's some other alternative. And often the L is that alternative.
Okay.
And so we do that a lot, where we use the L1 visa as a pseudo E, where we're using the L as to accomplish the exact same purpose as the E2, which is to bring over a business owner, an investor who's starting up a business here.
Wonderful. Okay, so if they're not eligible for the E, it's a possibility that they can be eligible for the
for the L.
L1.
And sometimes they, uh, on the other hand, the E2 visa, it's most often used for the main investor in a company, the owner,
Right.
but it can also be used um, to bring over executives, managers, or essential workers of the E2 business here. So not just
Mm,
the person who's putting in the money, but anybody from the home country who is coming here to run the business or to contribute essential knowledge to it. And so basically
that's valuable.
it's
Yeah.
the same types of employees you can bring over with an L, you can bring over with an E. And with an E visa, there's not the requirement that there exists an affiliate in the other country. So in some
Mm,
situations, maybe there is no entity in the home country, or it's already been closed, um, or it's in trouble and it might be shut down at some point.
mhm.
Um, but so we will only have the U.S. company, then the E will be the better alternative. Um, for L1s, also there's the requirement that the employee who's being transferred has to have worked at the foreign company for at least a year
Right.
in that executive or managerial role. So if it's a new employee, they might not qualify for the L, but the E has no such requirement. As long as this could be a brand new manager just freshly hired, as
Right.
long as they have the nationality of the E company, they can come over. So it's nice to have those two options because sometimes there might be some technical requirement that's a roadblock for one, but not for the other.
Awesome.
And the universe of clients who qualify for both is pretty big.
Really?
Yeah. One thing that's important also with ease is L's have a green card category that is almost an exact match for the L1. So that's based on the exact same requirements almost. And
Okay.
so the L1, you, an applicant will get an L1 for between 1 and 3 years, and that's renewable in 2 year stretches. But that person can also apply for a green card based on the exact same things, on working for a multinational as an executive or a manager
Okay.
or um, the E doesn't have an equivalent category that will let the person stay here permanently, not just on a temporary visa based on the same requirements. So it's important when somebody's coming over on an E and intends to stay here for good, that they think about possible green card options from the get go.
Interesting. So it would be easier to transfer or get a green card with the L, but with the E, there's just it's possible, but just more steps.
There's more steps, or for example, the L1 and the EB1C green card category, they're both for executives and executives and managers of multinationals, right?
Right.
The E2 visa and the EB5 green card category are both for investors,
Uh huh.
but the requirements for EB5 are so much higher than for
Right.
E2 that it might not really be a, a good fit for an EB5 won't necessarily be a good fit for every E2 applicant. And definitely it will require a lot more advanced planning
Right.
to eventually get an EB5 based on the same business. So for example, for E2, like we mentioned, there's no minimum investment amount. It just has to be substantial.
Right.
For EB5, there is a minimum amount, and it's either $800,000 or $1,050,000, depending on.
That's a big chunk of money.
It's a big chunk of money, and also there's a job creation requirement. For
Okay.
EB5, you must show that you've created 10 new US jobs based on your investment. And so, say for example, you're buying an E2 business,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you make a smaller investment, and then you want to invest more money into that business over time so that you eventually get to that 1 million. Well, how you document where that money came from, especially if it's money that was earned by the business and that you're reinvesting, you have to be really careful about how you
Oh,
document that reinvestment of yours so that when you apply for the EB5, immigration can clearly see that the money that you left in the business was really money that you reinvested. Because they want to see a paper trail, a very clear trail. So
they
usually,
want you to reinvest it then.
so usually, they want to see that for example, your business generated $1 million in profit, that you actually took that money out, paid taxes on it, and then put it back in versus just
Oh,
leaving it in the company's bank account.
understood. That makes
And
sense.
if you've been, and that's fine if you made $1 million in revenue,
Right.
and then you just take it out and then put it back in. But if it's been 100,000 one year and then 80,000 another year and so forth, you have to have been documenting that correctly over time so that you can actually account for $1 million investment several years later.
And that's why it's important for them to tell you at the beginning that that's their plan
That
to
that's their
stay
plan, so you
here.
can advise them correctly. Also, for the job creation requirement, 10 new U.S. jobs. So if you buy an existing business that already has 3 employees,
Hmm.
and then over time you hire 10 more employees so that you have 13, that's great. But how are you going to show immigration that these 10 new employees are new employees? Um,
Mm.
Especially if you hired those over 5 or 10 years, it, if you weren't planning on applying for an EB-5 green card, you wouldn't think during the due diligence process to ask the seller for records of how many employees, like their payroll records, for example, to show
Okay.
that the business had 3 employees and you hired 10 more, right? Because it's 10 compared to what?
Ah, okay.
Or there's an exception to that rule where if the business already has 10 employees, you can get credit for EB-5 um, by saving those jobs if the business was distressed. And the business is distressed when you buy it if it's been operating for at least 2 years and it's had losses of 20% or more during those 2 years. But again, once you close the transaction, the seller's not going to give you that information. You need to request that information during due diligence
Right.
before you close, while the seller is still motivated to hand over their records so
Uh-huh.
that you can show immigration, look, like they had 10 jobs, they have 10 jobs now, but the business would have gone broke if I hadn't come in with my money and saved those 10 jobs. So I should get credit for that and be allowed to get my green card. So you need to gather that documentation when you're buying the business and not after.
And that's for when you're buying an existing
An
business
existing
and
business.
buying not only the assets but actually just buying the business itself, right?
Correct.
Because a lot of people do these asset purchases where they buy the equipment, they may buy the name, but they're not keeping the actual business. So
That can work. If they are keeping the business's name and so immigration has been known to take the position that as much as it was couched as an asset purchase, really they purchased the business, and they won't credit the 10 jobs that are there now as 10 new jobs, because
mm,
they'll say, well, there was a business that was up and running, had 10 employees. Sure, it was an asset purchase, but nothing changed. The only thing that changed was who was running it. The operation stayed the same. Those people would have had their jobs, whether you had come in with your money or not, right? So you have to show
so
that it was
interesting.
distressed.
This is so interesting
Yeah.
because I will tell you, I'm learning just speaking with you because I know that we've talked about this and I've had clients that have E2s, but these are the types of things that, it's a good reminder because we only see one half of it, right? We don't see when they come to you and they're talking to these officers at USCIS and they're requiring these documentation. So this is always very nice to learn more things.
Yeah, and it's important to know what you don't know so that you can refer somebody to the right individual. And I do that also with, for example, the corporate side of a transaction. Sometimes we need to get to a certain percentage ownership by a specific person to qualify for an E or for an L.
Right.
And it's easy for me to say, well, okay, this person, you each have 33%. Why don't you just, move things around
Move
so that
things
you have
around.
50? But I mean, that has implications. That has
Right.
implications about, not
Tax.
taxes, about control over the company and who can make decisions over the company. And so it's important to talk to the right professional,
Right. Right.
right? And so it's important to talk to experts in the different areas that touch your transaction.
Awesome. I
Yeah.
mean, we've talked about so many things, and I feel like we could talk about this for hours. Um, but for your clients or for your future clients, what would be one piece of advice that you would give if they're coming for an E2 visa and want to come to your office and want to obtain an E2 visa? What would be one piece of advice that you would give them?
Just to plan early. Plan early. Um, it, I feel like 80% of clients who come in for a consult, they've already been chewing on this for a long time and they're ready to move tomorrow. And they haven't considered how long it's going to take them to get the funds together, to identify the business they want to purchase, to have a business plan for the business they want to open, to actually open it, and then to actually for us to prepare the application and for the consulate to review it.
Wow.
It might be months, if not years. And so plan early and plan thoroughly, because also missteps in planning that are discovered later are so much harder to fix than doing it right the first time around, and
Absolutely.
so much more expensive too.
Yeah, I think that that's something that clients may forget, that when you're trying to cut corners to save costs here and there, it might end up being more costly in the end when you have to pay someone out to fix it.
That's
We
right.
we see that a lot.
Yep.
So, well, Jose, thank you so much for your time
Thank
and for
you.
sharing all this information. I'm sure it's so valuable to so many people that are listening to you. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you.